Please stand by. We're about to begin. Good day and welcome to the Recall and IGI webinar to release the white paper Information Governance in a New Era. Today's conference is being recorded. Today's host is Rob Hamilton, Global Vice President. Please go ahead, sir.
Hi, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you for joining this call. And I'd like to introduce Blair. Blarclay, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, Blair. I'm founder and executive director of the Information Governance Initiative. So you'll hear more about our activities through our call. And I've been a consultant and writer in the space for, I guess, over a decade. And happy to be here with you, Rob.
Thanks very much for joining, Blarclay. Really appreciate all the assistance and guidance that you've provided, Recall and myself, as we're learning more and more about the challenges that organizations are facing in the information governance arena since the external environment has changed so dramatically. I'd say the last 5 years with the exponential growth of digital content, along with the increase in rules and regulations. And it's, when I see it, it's almost as if two fronts of a storm are kind of colliding into one, and many organizations are finding themselves not as prepared as maybe that they would have liked. And that's really what we're hearing a lot from our customer base. And so what we did was we wanted to go out and find thought leaders in the space and find individuals that were particularly knowledgeable about these types of challenges that organizations are facing, such as Blarclay, and ask him to provide some additional research and really put some structure around the anecdotal information that our customer base was giving us, and be able to take that structured approach and feed it back to the community. So that's really the purpose of this white paper, and I hope that you find the content useful for your organization. And I recognize how busy all of you are, and for you to dedicate an hour, we want to thank you. So we'll jump right into the content of the white paper, and we're going to try to keep this a very open forum. So if you have a question, please feel free just to type in your question under the Q&A area on the webinar. And Blarclay and I will be just having more of a conversational than presentation type of a format here today. So the first thing that I mentioned, Blarclay, is that what we're hearing is organizations are really challenged around the information and the quantity of information, particularly in the digital information that's coming in. What did you find when you started looking at that area? What were some of the findings that were most pertinent to your research?
Yeah, I think just to kind of build off of what you said, I've seen this expression that, there's a tidal wave of information or a tsunami or what have you. And actually, I think that's an inapt metaphor because, tsunamis, of course, are devastating, horrible things, but they come and they go. And the reality is with the information landscape, it's rising water, and it's not returning to the sea. It just continues to rise and rise. And I think that, as a whole, I think globally we've responded to that in really I would say the most brute force way possible, which is just to continue to buy more storage. And what I'm seeing and hearing in our research revealed is that I think more and more companies realize that that's just unsustainable. It's an untenable way to deal with this incredible growth. At most organizations, it's at least doubling every 2 years, and numbers like this just start to become nonsensical after a while. What does it mean that it's going to multiply by 44 times? Over the next decade? We know what it means is that it means that the way that we manage information today just can't continue, simply for this reason, that there's just too much of it, and added to that, I think is when we talk to clients and we talk to the market, the other interesting thing is that most of the pain and most of the challenge seems to center around the unstructured stuff, the stuff that sits outside the rows and columns of the database. And the numbers show that.
Could you share a little bit more about structured and unstructured? Because I think in my conversation there's a lot of confusion around what is it, what's unstructured information.
Yeah, sure. And I think we should spend some time on it because the unstructured stuff is, as you see on the slide, it's growing actually faster than information as a whole. The important thing about unstructured information is at its most basic, it's really the information that sits outside of a database. So it's the email and it's the office documents, your presentations, your PDFs, your Word documents, and so on. And as opposed to, the numbers that typically sit in the rows and columns of a database. Now, the reason why that's important is that when I have a number in a field in the database, you just think of a spreadsheet in front of you. You can look at the row label and you look at the column label and you can figure out from the context what that number means. But you can't do the same thing, well, at least it's harder to do the same thing with unstructured information. An email message that says yes, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything unless I can kind of reconstruct it in the context of an email chain, unless I understand who the people are who are having this discussion and I can understand the topic. And so it's a difficult pool of information to manage, and it's where I think most people are having challenges. I mean, is that what you hear, Rob, from your customers as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the unstructured, it's the PowerPoints, the contracts, the items that if they don't have the appropriate metadata assigned, and then constricting the business user to put all that metadata in doesn't really help with employee engagement or productivity. So that's really the challenge of trying to take that unstructured data and making it structured in some format, or at least in some way identifiable.
Right. Yeah, so I think that is the nut of the challenge. We have, the way that I like to kind of think of this is that we moved from a world that was perfected in the 1950s, where we had a mailroom, we had a secretarial pool, and we had records clerks, and the three of those things together really effectively took care of this problem of managing the unstructured stuff, the documents, the things that flowed through our organization. And we've tried to kind of apply that model to the digital world, but it doesn't work. In the digital world, anyone can create a record at any time, at any place in the company, and they can send it to anyone at any time, for free. And so the mailroom doesn't work anymore, we don't have the secretarial pool anymore, and we don't have a records room for the digital stuff anymore. And we've tried to duplicate that in the digital world, and it's been a challenge.
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads into the last bullet point on here, where we're looking at stored or related software. And, because it's unstructured, IT is really crippled in their ability to do anything with it. So that they don't know what it is, they can't go ahead and defensively delete it or identify or apply policy towards it. So really, their only alternative is to try to drive down or get cheaper storage. And it's that multi-function within the organization between the IT, the legal, the records management, the end user, that really, I think, is causing that tide to continue to rise, as you mentioned before, and where the focus has been on storage instead of on governance.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, I agree, and it's not, it's not IT's fault, right? It's, IT hasn't been given the mandate to solve this problem other than from an infrastructure point of view. In other words, look for storage efficiency, but that's just kind of, chipping away at the problem. The real problem is, is improving, controlling what comes into the storage in the first place and how long it stays there. And that's the goal of information governance, and it's not, it's a shared responsibility, as I think you said, Rob, with IT and the business and the end user.
Yeah. The next slide we're looking at in terms of the visual on the information is exploding is a little scary when you start thinking about the exponential growth. And you start looking at, what is it going to look like? And this is only 4 years out. So how is that impacting organizations, and how are they preparing for it going forward?
Yeah, it's I think that there's, when you really look at the numbers, you start to get a sense of how significant this problem is. And a lot of, we found that a lot of organizations in the market are looking at defensible deletion and other projects, which we certainly heartily endorse. But you have to remember that, defensible deletion is a a great project, but you're up against this enormous growth rate. So you really have to ask yourself, you know, is that project really going to solve the problem long term? You know, are you going to, if this growth rate continues, can you really backfill with the defensible deletion program quick enough to kind of address this problem? I think for most companies, the answer to that's going to be no, and they need to deal with the problem as it's coming into the storage environment.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in today's competitive landscape, there's really value to this unstructured data. There's really a significant value if the organization can somehow harness it. But it's particularly difficult for them. So I think the bullet point here that was pretty interesting is that, you know, it would be useful for big data if it were managed well, but only 3% is usable. So how do you position your organization better to capitalize on that unstructured data?
Well, that's what I said, you know, at the outset, Rob, is that you know, we've taken this brute force and I would say kind of brain dead approach to the growth of digital information, which is just to continually add more storage, and it doesn't help us address any of the problems. It doesn't help us address the risk problem. And more organizations now with kind of this hype cycle around big data are starting to ask the question, well, how can we extract value from the data? And they're finding that if their information environment isn't managed properly, they can't separate the wheat from the chaff. They don't know where the valuable data is. And to begin to do statistical analysis on that data is very challenging and difficult unless when they can't even do rudimentary kind of classification or organization of that information. You know, we see this, and our study found that, you know, up to 80% of, you know, the total infrastructure of many organizations is devoted to storing content that really has no value. I mean, it's duplicative, it's outdated, and, you know, again, we need to do better than that. We have not done a good job, and I don't think that these promises of big data and analytics can be realized until we can at least get some of this basic blocking and tackling done on the classification and the management side of information. And, you know, we're not doing a good job. I mean, that's the reality.
No. I think it's interesting to look at particularly when you're trying to identify areas of opportunity for return on investment for information governance, which is a challenge that we're hearing from organizations. Conceptually, they understand they need to do something about it, but how do I quantify and put a business case together and really put that forth to the executives and get them to sponsor and fund an information governance solution? And when you look at some of these different little buckets that you've identified here in terms of the redundant information, or what we call ROT, the redundant, obsolete, or trivial information that's sitting on the IT infrastructure, the deferred costs of getting rid of that, or if you're in a cloud-based type of storage environment, the actual cost of getting rid of that is big, and that can help with that funding. But one point that's really interesting here, and I don't know how much research has been done, maybe you could shed some light on it, but in terms of how do you identify the value of that information? So, you know, if you were able to extract that content for the big data, for example, what does that associate in terms of dollars for the organization?
Yeah, I mean, well, let's pop over to the next slide, and there's, you know, a model that kind of talks about that we can kind of look at. But I think that what we hear around big data is that the challenge with quantifying the value of information is so organizationally specific that, yes, there's definitely economic models like return on investment and net present value and well-established models that we need to bring into the enterprise and apply with rigor to information. But the challenge is that, you know, the value of information is so contextual and dependent on so many factors that it's hard to universalize it. I mean, we can talk anecdotally, and we can talk about, you know, we're aware of, you know, large industrial manufacturer whose products, whether they're engines or turbines or industrial equipment that generate reams of data that would be incredibly useful not only from the perspective of maintenance and improving manufacturing, but probably you could even do economic predictions and other really interesting things from the data. but their customers frankly aren't comfortable with giving them the data. They need assurances that that data is going to be treated securely, that they're not violating any contractual or legal obligations in sharing that data, and that's really the role of information governance. I think that's where information governance becomes an enabler of these business models rather than something that adds friction to the business process. If we can give the parties certainty that the sharing, the use, the analysis, the monetization of this data can be done in a way that doesn't run afoul of our agreements and commitments, I think that's really empowering to, business models like that.
Yeah, I agree. So moving on to the information governance needs, did your research find that we're needing more governance or we're needing less governance, and really why?
Yeah. I mean, the problem, the challenge, I guess I should say, is just growing, and it's growing dramatically. We've talked about the complexity of the problem in and of itself changes based on these extreme volume changes, but it also is changing because of the kinds of information that we're generating and because of the legal and operating environment that we're in, and we'll talk about some specifics about that later. But yeah, the problem is just getting more complex. It's getting more complex. As I say, from a volume perspective, from a variety of information perspective, and from a legal operating context perspective. So, there's interesting studies that show, as we talked about in the paper, that not only is unstructured information, i.e. the stuff that's giving us fits, growing more quickly than structured information, but more of that stuff over time will require some form of governance. And so, the upshot, just as the last bullet said, which I think captures it distinctly, is that the problem of the governance is actually growing faster than the problem of, information volume itself, and that's the reality that we found organizations are facing.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're starting to hear more and more questions from our customers in, more of the developing countries around governance now. It seems as though laws are being enforced more. Maybe there was a law there, but it wasn't necessarily enforced, or they're creating new laws. And really, there tends to be a lag from when a law comes into place to when it's actually enforced. So since the global financial crisis, there seems to have been a lot of regulation that was put on the books that now organizations are really starting to feel.
Yeah.
And they're feeling it not only either through the implementation or just the enforcement of it.
Right. No, that's absolutely true, and I think we have, we have a couple of slides about that. We can talk about some of the specific numbers, but yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. You take a country like Brazil. If you're operating in Brazil, you can face a situation right now where literally one day you have a pretty rudimentary or non-existent health and safety regulatory regime, and the next day you have a full-blown U.S.-style regulatory regime in that area. So if you're doing business there, all of a sudden you have, potentially hundreds of new requirements that you have to fulfill. And so, these problems aren't static. I mean, that's, I think, a big change is that, there's these regulatory movements that occur and have occurred in the wake of the financial crisis, and you have developing nations coming online with modern regulatory systems. And so if you're doing business globally, it's just always in constant flux. And there's also, I think, this illusion or myth that, when that happens, that you just need to go online and open a database and pull up the listing, and it'll tell you exactly what kind of records you need to keep and how long you need to keep it and how you need to keep it. And it's not true. I mean, in most cases, there's a significant interpretive challenge to kind of, go from what the law specifies to what that actually means to your records retention program. And that's a big challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting to think that, the regulatory environment and the legal environment is forcing organizations to get out, to manage their structured data and identify what the structured data is, and then in turn that it gives them the ability to govern it, and it also gives them the ability to then extract value out of it. So it's kind of an interesting paradox.
Right. No, I think it's like a dose of medicine sort of being forced down your gullet, and it has a net positive effect. I think you could say the same things happen in the U.S. because of the e-discovery situation here, that there's no question that being forced to go through an e-discovery process at gunpoint, kind of through litigation, does wake organizations up to not only how bad they're doing at managing information, but how good they could be doing by making some relatively simple changes,
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to a question to the audience. So what we'd like to know from you in terms of what are you focusing on in your phase 1 of information governance? So are you focusing predominantly on the physical records? Are you focusing predominantly on the digital records? Or are you focusing predominantly on both at the same time in terms of your phase 1? So just give a couple seconds for the participants to give their information back.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We see, I think, a lot of organizations out there are struggling to understand also what the bridge is between these two worlds. Is it the same organization? Is it a different organization that does the digital versus the physical? They're all part of the same program. Where should it report? There's a lot of transition happening. So I'm kind of interested just to see from the poll how folks are handling this.
Yeah, it's interesting when you use the term bridge. I think a lot of organizations talk about the bridge between physical and digital and back and forth. And really the way that we like to look at it is it's more of a link. The governance links the two because it doesn't really matter what format the content is in. We've been talking about unstructured data, but unstructured data could be a record that's unidentified in a carton, either within the walls of an organization or outsourced. So it's really interesting when you start looking at unstructured is really just the inability to know what it is, more so than it is, just having to be in electronic format.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So let's post the results of the survey to see what our participants and audience stated. So from my reading right now, it's fluctuating slightly. But basically, we're looking at about 17% focusing on physical first, 20% focusing on digital first, and 62% focusing on both at the same time in phase 1, which is quite interesting.
Well, it's good. I think it's good news. It's, like you say, I think that is a reflection of this realization that, the management principles and the goals are the same. How you operationalize those, of course, is different depending on the kind of media that you're talking about, but viewing them through the same lens, in the same way that I think with information governance, we're also looking at information security, we're looking at privacy, we're looking at analytics kind of through the same lens. I think that's a really healthy response.
Yeah, I would say that that's definitely a very encouraging sign to see that organizations are looking at it and at both. So I'm excited to see that because oftentimes we find organizations particularly focused on one or the other. And I think it's exciting to see such a large percentage focusing on both because they really both need to be addressed and governed.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
So just turning the conversation over, because we've talked so much about the digital side. What did you find from the paper side?
Yeah, the companies that we talked to and preparing the report, reported about an average of 10% annual growth in the volume of stored paper records. Now there was, the median would probably be a bit different than that. I think it varies somewhat by vertical, but, it's still a significant portion of the challenge. The other result we got from them is, at least 30% of the records they think have passed the mandatory retention periods. I think that's probably pretty conservative. Based on what I've seen in the consulting world, it's often higher than that. The other challenge, we talked to one organization that said they spent about $100,000 inventorying records in its record facility with the goal of disposing of at least half of it. But at the end of that process, the lawyers still didn't feel comfortable enough or adequately armed to make a decision to pull the trigger. So, we still have these challenges that, I think there's an illusion that paper's been around for long enough that we've got this thing baked, but, that's not what we found. I think that, there's very well-established mature programs, but they suffer from the same problems that, digital and electronic records programs suffer from in terms of, do we know enough about these records before they're sent to, offsite storage? Do we have, good handle on what that stuff is and how long we're supposed to be keeping it, and are we adhering to that? So, what do you guys see? You're dealing with customers facing these challenges every day.
Yeah, what we're finding is that organizations have done, I would say, a fairly good job developing their policies, or at least understanding their policies. But the challenge that they're having is that their policies are developed in a relatively stagnant environment. They either put it in a Word document, a PDF, or a Excel spreadsheet with the master classification with some type of retention associated to it. And it's pretty easy in that environment to state what the policy is. So, for example, if you have an employment contract and your policy states that I have to get rid of this contract 7 years after the employee leaves, that's very easy for me to state. What's challenging is the fact that there's a life cycle action that's required. Yeah. And so that life cycle action is when the employee leaves, and when I create the document, I don't know when that employee is leaving. So that's really where I think what's happening with organizations is they understand what should be done, but they don't have the link between what should be done and the life cycle to be able to actually take action on it. And then oftentimes individuals will move within that 7-year period of time, either to different functions or to different organizations. And then if you don't have an automated type of system, that content gets lost, whether it's physical or digital.
I think it's such a clear theme, through this paper is that, automation is clearly the future, right, of how we solve this problem. And I know you and I have talked about this, Rob, that, we last year, the National Archives and Records Administration had an industry day in D.C. and I think it was, one of these events, I happened to go to it, and I sort of feel it was an epochal kind of event in the sense that you had the nation's record keeper, kind of the high church in many ways, if you will, of records management, and they were saying to the world, look, we don't really believe that traditional records management works anymore, and we believe the future is automation. And I think that marks the end of one era and the beginning of the other, which is, we can finally kind of admit to each other that these paper policies that are static and not connected to any mechanism to enforce them are just yesterday's news, and that moving forward we need, more sophistication. When NARA says automation, it doesn't necessarily mean, the latest and greatest fancy machine-based learning technology. An example is role-based classification of email. So saying we're just going to keep, all the managing director's email for 5 years or whatever it is. That's a form of automation. But them saying that that's legitimate, and other forms of automation, including machine-based learning, I think you can't overstate the importance of that. And I think the tone that it sets for everyone, whether they're managing paper or digital, is incredibly important.
Yeah, the way that I look at it is, obviously I'm an evangelist for governance, right? But I'm also a business user. So without that type of automation, then you're really pushing a lot of that obligation onto the business user. And I think that degrades employee engagement. When you do that, I think it slows business down. And I think that we've reached a point from a technology standpoint where there are solutions that are cost-effective solutions out there today to be able to automate it and take off that constraint off of the end business user. Because at the end of the day, they're going to try to do their job the best they can, and they're going to try to identify workarounds unless they have the appropriate change management there and they really understand the value of classifying that. But even if they do, the demands that we put on business users every day to ask them then to go ahead and classify all of these records and do that, I think it's not realistic.
I couldn't agree more. I think plainly it's a fantasy. I mean, I think that, yes, there's always the exceptions, and there's probably people on the line that are going, but we do that, and I think that, yes, I mean, I've built them and I've seen them, programs where basically imposing a kind of 1950s approach that's but where every employee now becomes a record clerk instead of a group of record clerks. It can work in certain kinds of companies that are have really clear processes and they have really clear external requirements, but even in those it's a challenge. But the case clearly is it's not a model that's broadly applicable, and it's not necessary anymore. We have options, I think, from a technological perspective to do something that's just smarter and better and gets us where we want to go in a much more realistic way.
So talk to me about what the research found in terms of the drive for more retention, because that's one of the questions that we have from our customers often is retention increasing or is retention decreasing? Are we going to be able to start, as a trend, should I be forecasting either my digital storage or my physical storage? Should I be anticipating that to go up and I have to hold on to things longer, or should I be anticipating that to go down and I can start generating some cost savings out of that?
Yeah, I mean, of course I would never represent that we look at every law in every country in the world, but we did not see any instance where retention periods were being shortened by any regulator. I mean, the clear trend is towards lengthening those. I found that this was probably some of the most interesting part of the research that we did, that there's a clear trend towards more prescriptive regulation in general, which, in other words, defining more specifically what it is we need to do rather than a principle-based approach, which is say, we want you to figure out a way to accomplish compliance with this law, rather saying we want you to keep this stuff and this stuff and this stuff and this stuff, and we want you to do it in a specific kind of way. So there's more prescription, there's more granularity, moving away from really a principle-based approach. And that clearly drives up the length of retention, it drives up complexity and cost, and I think increases the percentage of information that's subject to mandatory retention rules. So I'll give you an example. So, in April of last year, the UK abolished its primary financial regulator, that was the Financial Services Authority, and replaced it with two new bodies. There's the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulation Authority. So, we talked to Steve Formica, who heads up a company called Fontes International that, provides legal information for our retention schedules, and said, well, hey, I mean, what's happening in your database, what's happening with your customers as a result of this change? He said, well, in our database, we basically pulled out 104 existing retention requirements that were from the old regulator and have replaced them with 686 new entries and counting from the new requirements of the new regulators. So not only was there a numeric increase, but, he also told us that was also a substantial increase in the specificity and a move away from a broader principle-based regulation. In the U.S., Dodd-Frank, there's, nearly 400 rulemaking requirements, and hundreds of those are still moving through the approval process, and embedded in those hundreds of regulations are new and complex record-keeping requirements. U.S. Food and Drug Administration, 2013, they put out a 1,200-page new regulations around food safety. And, again, these rules are creating new and prescriptive and complex retention requirements. So the simple answer is the trend in lawmaking and regulation is more records for longer. I think there's no other way to look at it.
Well, when you're looking at that investment that you have to put in, it's almost as you have to do kind of a cost-benefit analysis in terms of, do I have to do this? I mean, I understand that you're, as a regulator, is wanting me to do this, but is there any real, teeth to the law, for example? And I think your research identified that as well. So one of the things you first ask is it increasing or decreasing? And then what is my actual obligation, or my more, that's maybe a better way of saying it, what is my exposure as an organization by not complying with these increasing retention requirements and the granularity of the records retention requirement? And so I think you touched on that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I think it's a complex topic, but I mean, there's a bunch of ways to calculate that, and you see some of them on this slide here that, you don't have to look very far to see evidence that globally regulators have stepped up enforcement activity around records. The financial meltdown in 2008, one of the things it revealed very clearly is the incompleteness in let's just say it plainly, the really bad job that organizations were doing on managing these records that were the core of their business, that showed who owned a house, for example. There's thousands and thousands of those cases in the U.S. and globally as well, that, when the economy was booming and growing and everybody's making money, the last thing they want to think about, of course, when it crashes, we realize that we should have been doing a better job. So a lot of those chickens are coming home to roost now for companies, and you see some of them here. So, the fines and so on, those are the things that are easy to quantify, and they're certainly out there. I think, in making this determination is, there's often more subtle factors at work. What is the cost in, management attention units to a regulatory investigation? Do you want your senior executives worried about the company going out of business or losing half of its stock value because of the outcome of an investigation, or do you want them focused on, growing the business? And, the answer is obvious, and, I think good record keeping and information governance is a bulwark against that.
One of the things that we're hearing from our customers is that we have large enterprises that are very global in nature, and they have business operations in all these different countries and different jurisdictions, and so they're challenged with that. But we're also hearing, as we mentioned before, more from our developing countries in terms of what are the rules and regulations associated with their retention and what do they need to do. But what's also interesting, though, is the businesses that sometimes don't think that they're necessarily global now, with the development and the commerce that's able to be transcribed through the internet, have become much more globalized. Right. So in terms of getting supplies or partnering with a vendor that's from a different country, or even your customer base now being from a different country, it's much more easily done through the internet than it ever has been before, and that's really creating a lot more importance in terms of understanding what are those laws outside of maybe your initial jurisdiction.
Right. I mean, it's growth for global companies clearly is going to come from outside the U.S. and the West, right? And along with that, information growth will come from those parts of the world as well. One of the stats we came across was that, so in 2005, so almost 10 years ago, about 50% of the world's information was created in the U.S. and in Western Europe. And in 6 years, in 2020, the percentage coming from emerging markets will be 62%. So the balance, will swing. And so for companies that want to grow and are operating outside of a national environment, that's the reality that we're going to face. I mean, I spent the morning working through an issue with somebody about, you look at what's happened with the NSA and data collection, And, there's, Obama had announced this morning, a move towards limiting collection of phone records by the NSA. And if you look at the rules and regulations, even in the U.S. versus the EU, for how long those records are kept, it's a totally different regulatory environment. I mean, you have a maximum retention period in Europe, and you have a minimum retention period in the U.S. So there couldn't be more different, and it's just one example in one vertical. So it's, regulatory modernization means a move towards increased regulation, and along with that, increased specificity, granularity, and complexity for us.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing would be interesting to know from our audience is, what type of solutions are they looking for in terms of identifying the different technologies to help them with their information governance issues. So I just wanted to open up a poll real fast and just have a conversation on that. Around, we've talked, and I think we've created an environment, or at least hopefully have established an environment that's actually happening out there, and it would be good to know what type of technology are they utilizing to try to solve those problems.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge for our listeners, no doubt, is that all of this transition that we're talking about in the operating environment extends, I think, equally to the technology environment, that your options are becoming more diverse, and the way this market is kind of shifting and changing, and the way the technology is coming to it is changing. So I think it's a confusing space in terms of what you need to go out and buy. And I think more than ever, it's important to look for providers that have a strong understanding of the problem, and they can provide technology around that problem, as opposed to someone who has a solution that's out looking for a problem to solve, which is fairly common in the technology world.
Yeah, and adding to the complexity, I think from the response of the audiences, they're using multiple things to try to solve this issue. So the respondents coming in at 41% are saying that they're using a combination of enterprise content management, SharePoint, email archiving, e-discovery.
Yeah, interesting.
That adds to the complexity of the solution.
Yeah, and it's not surprising. I mean, that's what we see. What we see out there for sure is a very heterogeneous environment. That's a mix of legacy repositories that are broken because they can't scale to the volume that's required, and then it seems like we can never get rid of shared drives. Everybody there, it's the simplest solution to a problem that ultimately, of course, compounds the problem. But yeah, interesting.
So what are you finding in terms of, because not only we need to look at the trends of the regulators and the litigators, but what are you finding about the actual enterprise, the users? What are you finding about that in the research of the white paper?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of feel like I'm, one of those guys with a long white beard and a sign, out on the street saying the end is nigh. But I mean, yeah, that's not the message I want to leave people with. But you do have to, on top of the things that we've been talking about, the operating environment from a regulatory perspective is there's definitely more scrutiny, there's more specificity, there's new rules and regulations. And the other thing is that the way that we would go about solving these problems from a technology perspective is clearly changing as well. I was at a meeting of CIOs just the other day, and there's hundreds of these events happening around the world, which is what is the future of the CIO, and there's lots of hand wringing. And the one CIO said, "Look, I think that ultimately what I am is a service provider to the business, and whether I provide that service through IT that we own and is in our data center, or whether I'm providing it through a cloud provider or a third-party provider of some kind, doesn't ultimately matter, because my job is to provide the service." And I think that it's, the day that the first CEO came into his or her company and with an iPhone and said, "There's no way I'm going back to a BlackBerry. was the day that everything started to change, in the sense of, like, now you have a device that was designed for the consumer that, comes into the enterprise, and it changes the dynamic between the user and IT, and that's being replicated across the entire realm of applications that we use to do business. I use file sharing technology every day to share files with large companies who undoubtedly have millions of dollars invested in enterprise solutions to do the same. So yeah, I think it's the way that IT is delivered in the enterprise is changing dramatically, and that's something else that we need to think about when we look at architecting IG solutions.
Yeah, the IT has really become a consumer-based product, because it's probably not the CIO that came in with that iPhone, but it's more of the chairman of the board.
Right.
That came in with it and said, I'm not using that BlackBerry anymore.
Yeah. Right. I think that's exactly what happened. So
what about the requirements? Did you find they're staying consistent, or they're multiplying, or?
Well, Bill, I think on this, we've touched on this, I think already, but, again, in my consulting practice, we build retention schedules and have been doing that for many years. And I can tell you that the list of citations isn't going down. It goes up every year. And, we see, again, we talked to, John Montagna, we talked to Gene Caldwell, we talked to, Don Skufsky and other people that are in the business of providing these services and databases, and they continue to grow, year after year, by 10, 15, 20%, depending on how you cut it up. So yeah, again, they're increasing.
So I guess one question I'd like to ask the audience is, from their perspective within their organization, if all these requirements are increasing and they're multiplying, who's ultimately responsible for that within your organization? So who really owns the records retention periods within your organization? So I'd just like to open up the poll quickly. We really hear a number of different things. So I'd like to hear from the audience in terms of who do they think owns it.
One of the things I wanted to mention here too is that, we talked to Karen Sampson, who's been building, retention schedules for more than 30 years. And one of the great things out of that conversation was, just talking about some of the myths that people have about retention. Again, I think that over and over we heard this from the other people as well, that there's this myth that, you open up the law book and it says, you have to keep this form for this like the time. And in some cases that is the case, but, she told us, like, it gets incredibly complicated. Like, there's laws that have a requirement to create a record, but they don't actually state a retention period. There's requirements to file a record with an agency without stating a retention period for that record. There's requirements to dispose of a record after an event, which is incredibly difficult to track. Event-based retention periods in general, which is, keep these things for 6 years after an account closing. Those are really hard to implement. And then there's other places where the retention requirements are for a specific number of years, but the law doesn't tell you when the clock's supposed to start. So there's incredible complexity, and across multiple jurisdictions, it adds up.
What we're seeing from the audience is that it's predominantly sitting with I guess you could say, a legal function of compliance, and at the global level, if you kind of add them up and you look at the legal compliance and the global records management group,
right,
are making up about 58%, which is pretty interesting.
That's good news. I think it's a reflection of what we're talking about. That anyone who bumps into these issues very quickly realizes that that's really the only way to tackle this. You have to take a global perspective.
So I think, in starting to conclude the webinar, really, what are some of the key findings that you identified that the audience should be taking back to internally within their organization to be able to drive change within their organization around information governance?
Well, I think there's a few things. I like to to borrow a phrase. I think with information governance, it's critical that we think about this problem globally, but we act locally. In other words, the problem of information clearly is something that needs to be coordinated, and solutions to that problem that needs to be coordinated at an enterprise level. But ultimately, the value of managing it better is felt at the departmental or the business unit level. And understanding that is, I think, a key to success. Is that waving your hands and making big enterprise prognostications and policies and all the rest of that, that's fine. But the question is, what's ultimately going to provide value to the user at the departmental or the business unit level? So you really need to understand that, and that's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to go out and talk to those parts of the business and understand, exactly what's driving them. To give you an example, we talked to, a very large integrated, conglomerate, and they had a construction division, and in the construction business, they build these multi-million-dollar industrial properties, and there's always a 10-15% holdback. So it might be tens of millions of dollars that the owner of the facility continues to hold until the building or the refinery is actually finished. And as a matter of practice in that industry, litigation always commences at the end because it's advantageous for the building owner just to sit on the money for 3 or 4 years while the litigation goes about. And a big driver for them to invest in information governance was basically so that if there was any complaint raised by the building owner at the turnover process, they would have ready access to the information and records in their possession that they will know that claim that we didn't properly inspect the foundation or we didn't do this part of the construction process has no merit, and thus to put that dispute to bed early and get the money in the bank sooner. So that's a really specific business case for information governance that you need to understand that part of the business very well to go after. So that's one thing. The other thing I think is, building the business case is critical. Again, I think that you can often get these projects started with a risk focus, and it really depends on the culture of your organization, the orientation towards risk, but clearly that's a very opportune time as if something bad has happened. But beyond that, it won't sustain it. The only way that you'll sustain information governance is if you can build a business case for it. And that's more art than science in my view. I think that, building an ROI, not to be too cynical, but it's more of a political exercise than it is an economic exercise. And what I mean by that is you really need to understand what your organization cares about and build the business case around that. It's not outright manipulation, but to understand culturally what is it that drives the organization and how can you tie your project to that. And I think there's many legitimate ways to do that. In fact, you guys have worked on a business case for IG, I think, haven't you, Rob?
Yeah, we actually did an internal business case, which was quite interesting because we had to get our CEO and CFO to sign off and on information governance for our own internal implementation. And there were some very critical learnings there that we found our customers were experiencing as well. And although it is kind of more art or science, you do have to have an ROI at the end of the day. And so what we tried to do was come up with one that was repeatable. And so we have an ROI calculator now that we use and that we provide to our customers. So if anybody has interest in it, I think we're going to send that ROI calculator out as well. Mm-hmm. But really what it does is it focuses on risk, but many organizations don't have as much risk, or that won't drive change unless it's a scenario which you described where something really bad has happened. But it's focusing more on the productivity and the reduction in cost from a legal standpoint and an IT standpoint. And, in the example that you gave of that construction company, I think that would really fall under productivity. So how do you make and empower your organization to be able to provide the information either to your customers or to your vendors that's necessary to be able to do business in the most efficient and effective way? So what return does that give? Because if you don't have governance, what we find is that you oftentimes will put your company at a disadvantage, and you'll have to run through a fire drill when those external circumstances arise. And when you're running through those fire drills, resources are being deferred from the actual business that your core competency of your organization. So your legal department now is no longer concentrating on a new customer contract, but they're concentrating on an e-discovery environment. And what does that impact to your organization? So I think the ROI is critical, and what we try to persuade organizations is to understand the hard and soft cost savings.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. I mean, the other one I just wanted to highlight before we wrap up is that, I feel like, what's retention schedules are an interesting animal, and I think that they are, they're underestimated in terms of their value in understanding an organization. What I mean by that point, the second last bullet point, is that the knowledge that you gain about a company and how it works through creating and maintaining a retention schedule is actually a great starting point for addressing non-retention issues, business issues, privacy, security, and so on, because you actually you need to understand, at the end of that process, you understand how the business is structured, you understand what it does, you understand who the major actors are, you understand what probably the processes, or at least the outputs of that business process. And so I think it's just such a strong, we don't think of them this way, but I think it's such a strong place to start to build out a broader information governance program.
Absolutely. Well, it looks like we're at the top of the hour. So I'd just like to thank you, Blarclay, for your assistance in helping Recall understand a little bit more formally what anecdotally our customers have been telling us, and then putting it in an environment that we could share with the community so that can help other organizations as well.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I wanted to also thank you, Recall, for supporting the Information Governance Initiative and our work there. As I said at the outset, we're really devoted to trying to advance thinking in the market around information governance, and your support certainly enables us to do that.
Absolutely, our pleasure. And we didn't get a chance for questions and answers, but if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. So please feel free to email Blarclay or myself directly. We'll make sure to get you a response to any of the questions that you may have had that arose from this webinar. So I'd just like to conclude the webinar and thank our audience for joining, and look forward to speaking with you and working with many of you in the future.
Thanks, Rob.
And this concludes today's conference. Thank you for your participation.